Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining this live event. Today we are going to discuss JPA versus Hibernate versus Spring Data and Spring Data JPA, and this is as a response to a question I got this week, and the answer is not that short, so I couldn't fit it into a comment. So I said it's better we have this event and some time to chat about it and discuss this subject together with code and visuals the way you are already used. So thank you very much for joining. Don't forget that you have a live chat there, so you can ask the questions and start discussions in the live chat. I say hi as well, and with that being said, I think we can begin our discussion. And let me share you my screen. And first of all, I would like to start. So discussion is about connection to the databases. It's about in general how you implement the database connectivity in your Java application. So the idea is the following: the confusion between what JPA is versus Hibernate versus Spring Data comes from the fact that well, you need to have a bit of a historical perspective on how the connection to the database, to a relational database, is implemented in your application. So I would like, before going into what JPA is and then what Hibernate is and then compare it to Spring Data, I would like to make sure that everyone knows everything from the very beginning, so how things started. I won't show code for everything because some of them you can already find in other videos on this channel, but you need to make sure that you need the very basics, you know the very basics. And if you have, this is your database, isn't it? So this is your database. Then you know that if you have an application, and if this is your application, you make use, of course, of the JDK in your application. And in the JDK you have a package that it's named Java SQL. And the idea is that this is not enough, isn't it? Because you cannot simply just connect the JDK to the database, to your relational database. And the reason you can't do that is because the JDK, the Java SQL package, only contains interfaces, only contains contracts. So always, in any kind of application that connects to a relational database, you need to use a driver. A driver, which is a library specifically created for a given database and which is created by its vendor, by the vendor of the database. So if this database is, say, MySQL, then the driver you use is MySQL as well. Good, but where is now, why did we end up having JPA, Hibernate, and later on Spring Data? Well, the problem is, first of all, that creating a connection to the database and working with the data, meaning retrieving data from the database or changing data in the database, altering the structure of the database, is pretty difficult. And if you will try, maybe you've tried at least once, and again, I think I have a video, at least one video on this channel in the Java Fundamentals playlist that you will find where I show how connectivity to direct connectivity to a database works. Only for creating a simple query, you will write many lines of code, you will have to treat SQL exception, so you have a try catch, you will have to take care of transactionability yourself, you will have to set up the parameters. It's many things you do, and for a very simple query you just end up having 20-30 lines of code, which is very verbose. And adding that in a normal application, in a production application, you have many places, many use cases that needs many operations on the database, you will see that you will end up having a lot of lines of code. So what did developers do actually? They started to create frameworks that is the usability of a connection to the relational database. And they started to create different frameworks, and we don't name them. We just say framework 1, framework 2, framework 3, and so on. So many ways in which what these frameworks try to do is they try to make you write less code to implement the connection to a database. Of course, a first step, because I see a question regarding the connection pool. A first step was that instead of having the application managing the connections itself, the management of the connections was extracted in a data source. So you have a data source that manages the connections, but still the data source, it's not enough to eliminate all the verbosity of the code that you write to work with the data in a relational database. So the data source is fine, but it only solves a part of the verbosity plus the fact that it correctly manages the connections such in a way in which you don't have to create one every time for every operation, which actually improves a lot the performance of your application. But then it still wasn't enough, so developers started to create frameworks. And some of these frameworks try to use different philosophies behind the scenes, and today I will focus on ORM because the discussion is about JPA and Hibernate. Now, the problem is that if in your application now you try to replace this framework with this one, think about many years ago. So what I'm telling you now is historically. That's why I don't even name the frameworks, because you don't need to even think about what frameworks are these. Just think about historically, 15-20 years ago. So many years ago, when Java looked like this, I was a child and dinosaurs still ruled the earth, you had multiple frameworks and they were totally unrelated one to the other. And then what happened is that if you try to, for some reason, figure out it doesn't work for you and you try to shift them to replace one with the other, it doesn't work so easily because you have to change a lot of code. And at that time also the applications were mainly monolithical, which means that if the app started to be built many years ago, a few years ago, you already have one artifact, one code base with all the functionality using framework 1, and if you want to replace it with framework 2, things are nasty. So that's where Java EE at that time, which now has the name Jakarta EE since 2019, we name it Jakarta EE. It's what previously formerly known as Java EE, described JPA. And what is JPA? JPA is a specification. So JPA is not a framework, is not an implementation, is not something you can use directly to connect to a relational database in any way. JPA, which is Java Persistence API, is only a specification that was formerly part of Java EE, and now Java EE became Jakarta EE, but that's irrelevant. JPA is still a specification telling how should you implement an ORM framework such that multiple implementations of the same specification, so for JPA, one of the implementations is Hibernate. But another implementation is Eclipse Link. And anyway, there are multiple other implementations. But the difference is that they all fulfill the requirements of the same specification. And I actually opened here the document of the specification, which is a very large one, almost 700 pages. I hope this is the last one. It's one I found from September 2020, but again, it's irrelevant because we are not going to discuss this now. And here you find everything related to this specification. That means which objects should the framework implement and how should they work. So these are all the rules. JPA is a set of descriptions and rules that someone can implement to define an ORM framework. The advantage of having a specification is that if your application uses the JPA specification, then you can replace one framework with another, and you will not have to make a lot of changes theoretically. Even though, remember that JPA allows the frameworks to create things outside of the specification as long as they also fulfill the specification. And if you use directly those things, such as, for example, specific Hibernate properties, then they will be different, most likely, for Eclipse Link or another framework. So now that's basically JPA versus Hibernate, and that's the thing you need to remember. JPA is the specification, Hibernate is the implementation. Like Hibernate, you have other implementations and they all fulfill that set of rules. Now what these frameworks, either they are ORM or not, tried to do in the end is, of course, make your life easier in writing code, because instead of using directly the JDK and the driver and maybe the data source, which, as I started saying at the beginning, took many lines of code, it's very verbose. Now the frameworks, they help you write less code in the end by implementing themselves a big part of the functionality through different philosophies. Now I also see the questions, what's the trade-off using ORMs in your opinion? Well, that's a very good question actually, because in the end, if you use a framework, ORM or not, it doesn't really matter, although I would say that ORMs are particularly more difficult from my point of view. But the idea is the following. What frameworks do is that they minimize the number of lines of code, and if you use them properly, then they make your application easier to maintain, and of course the time of development is shortened, because instead of writing for each operation 20 lines of code, treating SQL exceptions, stuff like that, you might even implement some of the stuff with only a couple of lines of code. So you might say that with such a framework you might be even 10 times faster. Now the other point is that they are particularly difficult, and again especially ORM frameworks such as Hibernate is particularly difficult. The more it hides behind the scenes, if you don't know what it hides, if you don't learn the framework properly, then you might end up actually introducing problems, performance problems, even bugs, which sometimes are difficult to find, difficult to spot. So that the idea of these frameworks is the complexity they bring. Because to be honest with you, let's take Hibernate as an example. Do I think myself that I know Hibernate perfectly? I know Hibernate pretty well, but I gathered this knowledge in many years of experience, hands-on, with practical applications. And even in my, let's say, past 10 years since I'm using Hibernate in more than maybe 20 big projects, did I learn it 100%? Do I have do I trust that I know everything? No, I'm pretty sure that I still don't know everything about Hibernate. I know at this point hopefully enough so that I don't make a lot of mistakes, or maybe I don't make mistakes at all. But I can't say I know everything perfectly, and I can't say that I know by heart. Sometimes I only know where to look. Sometimes I have to do some debugging still to remember some things, because it's very large, and I'm only human, you know. So I can't memorize everything, and that's after many years of experience. So you see, frameworks are awesome because they minimize the verbosity, and in the end, if you use them properly, they maximize the maintainability and the testability, and even maybe sometimes the performance of your code or of your application. But if you don't use them properly, then they can become burden. So that's about frameworks, in my opinion, about the trade-offs with frameworks in general, being them ORM or not. Now I hope that by now I clarified the difference between Hibernate and JPA, so it should be clear for you, and hopefully you shouldn't now make a confusion between what JPA means and what Hibernate is. They are linked, and sometimes today this confusion is very, very often made just because it so happens that Hibernate, if I remember correctly, I even saw a survey, I think it was a Stack Overflow survey or something, and Hibernate it's used as an ORM framework in maybe more than 90% of the applications today. So that's why today somehow Hibernate became the convention, and Hibernate is the JPA implementation. So few people know that there are other JPA implementations and use them, like ORM Lite or Eclipse Link. It's a couple more that I've used in my years of experience, but Hibernate is today everywhere. So people make confusion between what Hibernate and JPA is, because somehow they started to become the same thing, but it's not the same thing. Okay, JPA is just a specification theoretically, and there are multiple implementations of this specification, and again, the reason was to be easier to replace a specification with another. JPA is like a contract. JPA is like an interface for multiple objects. Now, you know how you do in object-oriented programming, when you have an interface as a contract, and the purpose of the interface is to decouple another object from implementations of the same functionality. So same as interfaces work in Java, JPA works for ORM frameworks. So JPA is the contract your application uses. If it uses JPA and all the implementations fulfill the specification, then it should be easy to replace one with the other if ever needed. Now I'm not sure if that will ever happen again, because now started to become like Hibernate started to become the JPA implementation, as I said. And now let's talk about Hibernate versus Spring Data, because that's another very interesting. I would like to start by writing some code, and I would like to start writing some code to prove you that you can use Hibernate without Spring, because I don't want you to imagine that Hibernate is directly related to any application framework. You can use Hibernate. Today I will make a simple demonstration, but if you want, I have a playlist out there on this same channel that details everything about using Hibernate without frameworks. And you need to know that Hibernate can be used directly with plain Java, or you can use it with Spring, or you can use it with any other application framework together wherever you want. But Hibernate is independent. It's just an ORM framework that simplifies, if you know it well enough, it simplifies the connection to the database. Okay, let's start by doing that actually. So let me create a project. How do we name this? So say JPA Hibernate Spring Data E1, because that's our topic about. I think we can say quick start here and create. So I'm just creating a Maven project so that it's easier for me to grab the dependencies. So I have to wait a bit. And while I'm waiting, let me see if I can ask if I can answer some of your questions. So, resources to learn Hibernate. First of all, I would say the playlist on this channel. If you didn't find it already, it's free. It's on this channel. And then I can if you leave me a comment or you find me on Twitter or LinkedIn, I will tell you a book name that I like or a couple of books that I can recommend you for learning Hibernate. Connection pooling and real-time properties. Let's take that in another video, because I think is related to what I'm discussing here, is not directly related. So let's figure that out later in another session. And then what are the trade-offs? I already answered. Can you talk about application level transactions versus DB level? Let's take that on another session as well, because it's not directly related. Since when you started Java development many years ago, I can't remember. There are still dinosaurs somewhere around when I started learning that. And okay, and with that, I see that my indexing finished. So we can start by implementing. What I want to implement here is directly an application that uses Hibernate. Do I need JUnit? No, I don't need JUnit for this. And which are actually my so say Hibernate Maven dependencies. So I'm going to search for, because that's how I'm usually doing. I'm searching, and I will just take the latest Hibernate dependency. So then I don't need that, I think. What else do I need? I definitely need MySQL, because remember, so even if you use Hibernate, there is nothing that goes outside of using a driver. So the framework itself, they are still using the driver, because the driver gives the implementations for the interfaces in the JDK. So you cannot have at all an implementation without a driver. Okay. And do I need something else? I'm not sure if I need something else. I think I can already just reload, and we'll see later if we need something else for this. And now what I can do is what I need to do is I need to have a database, and I already have a database from some X tutorial, and it's called demo on my local. And let's just create a table to play with here. So let's just create a table product. And name. And this couple of columns should be enough. Okay. We can just, let's say we just select something. So let me add a couple of records. Okay. So can we, do I need this one? No. Can we write an application to connect to a database only with Hibernate, without Spring, without anything? Let's see. So we need first of all to define the configuration to a database. So how do we do that? We have two options. You either use an XML file that's called persistence XML, and you put it in the resources, which I don't have here, but I could add a resources folder that's in the class path, or we can do that programmatically. So you can also do that programmatically, and that's where you have to define a persistent unit info file. So let's call our demo persistence unit, and our demo persistence unit will implement persistence unit info, which you can see if I'm using the latest. So previously, if you were using an older version, this was Java instead of Jakarta, because this was part of Java EE, and since 2019, when it changed the name to Jakarta, due to legal purposes, they had to change the name completely because they weren't allowed to use Java. The name Java is restricted for Oracle only, so they had to change the name of the packages as well, and they changed the name in Jakarta, so that's why it looks like this. But if you use an older version, you will see the packages are all inside Java packages, which is, I don't want you to get scared if you see it's not something different, it's the same thing, okay? So it's just the same thing. And everything that you see now in Jakarta persistence is what is part of the JPA specification. But in the JPA, again, it's just a specification, so you don't have implementations, all right? So the implementations are coming with the framework, which in my case is Hibernate, because that's what I'm using here, which is the more than 90% used in applications as per the latest surveys I've seen. And you probably know that as well. So we need to override some methods. There are many of them, but no worries. In our tutorial, we don't need to like literally implement all of them. In real world applications, you might need to implement more. I will just stay with what is mandatory. So the name of the persistence unit is mandatory. The provider class name, so this is different according to what you use. So in my case, I think it's ORG, Hibernate, JPA, and then it was Hibernate persistence provider, if I correctly remember, because this one changed at some point with one of the versions. And then what do I actually need here? I need to specify the transaction type, which can be either resource local or JTA. Is resource local if you don't use a container. An application server is JTA if you want to make this a word and put it in an application server, but we don't do that, so we have resource local. And then of course we need the data source. So you see, Hibernate directly connects to a data source, which in the end takes the data, okay? To use a data source, I think I will just make again the use of the most known data source, which is Hikari. So let's just take the dependency from their official GitHub page, sorry, and add it to our POM.xml. Okay, and reload. So weird sound in the background can be my parrot maybe, or maybe my cooler. I'm not sure. I can make it lower like this. Tell me if it's better. And then is your JPA playlist still okay? Yes, it's still okay. You can go through it even if it's a couple of years old. The fundamentals didn't change, so you can still learn from what you learned there is still pretty much useful, like 100% useful. Okay, so I now go back here and I need to, that's non-JTA data source. I think it's what I need to define, because I'm using resource local. So Hikari data source, very strange. Let's try to reload again the project, because it seems that it didn't take my dependency, and then try it again. Again, very strange. Okay, all right. IntelliJ sometimes doesn't want to work with me, even though it costs a lot of money. I would say it should work. But what I do in that case, I try this kind of different tricks where I add the dependency again or something like that. And sometimes works, otherwise I have to restart it. But well, that's developer's burden. Okay. So let me see, it works now. Okay, doesn't work. Yeah, I will do that. I will actually say invalidate caches restart and try to answer the questions if you have meanwhile. So yeah, I don't see other questions, so we can actually just wait for IntelliJ to start again. In just a matter of a couple of lines of code, I have to declare a Hikari data source and then create it. Let's see if it works. Okay, have to wait a bit. So this last thing that I added, the Hikari CP, is the Hikari connection pool, and this is a data source. So the data source is basically, in my diagram, is this one here, the data source. It's managing the connections to a database, because if you don't have a data source, you either have to implement yourself the connection management, or you simply can fetch a connection every time you make an operation. But if you do that, then you lose a lot of performance, isn't it? Because you will have to like literally reconnect and re-authenticate for each and every operation, and you don't want that. So what the data source does, and especially what the Hikari connection pool does, it's called a connection pool, because it's literally what's doing is creating a connection pool. It's grabbing more connections, and then it's giving the connections to whatever thread is taking it. That's what we do. Spring Data also uses Hikari. Yes, that's true. So Hikari has been introduced, I think, if I correctly remember, as the convention data source to Spring Boot, starting with Spring Boot 2. And if I remember correctly, before Spring Boot 2, Tomcat connection pool was the one that has been at that time. So let me try again. Okay, so finally, again, I'm used with these kind of things with IntelliJ, so it's not something special. I knew that sometimes you need to do that. So now we seem to have the dependency have been properly imported, and that means we can use it. And that's where we will just set the JDBC URL, and the JDBC URL, username and password, they should not be in code like I'm doing here. You know that already, but now for the sake of saving some time, I will put them here. And I think the name of the database was demo. Okay, this is it. And in my case, I'm just using the user root with no password. Okay. Do I have to do something? Yes, I will also have to. Now I'm just going a step further, and I will create a package, entities. And you know that when you use any JPA implementation, we need to define entities, which are basically the objects that map the tables in the database, because that's why it's called ORM, object relational mappings. It's this philosophy where you use a context of objects mapping the data model in the database. So for every table in the database that represents an entity, you will have a class that's called the entity class in your application. So in my case here, what was the name? Product, I think. See, it's product. And what you need to do is use the entity annotation, and then I need to map properly the fields. So I say ID, I specify how I define the generation of the values, which in my case is identity, meaning auto increment, and string name. And since I didn't add Lombok, I will just have to generate the getters and setters, which is still fine. And now what I have to do is go back and somewhere here get manage class names. This is where you need to provide this is strange, acting very strange, okay, finally my IntelliJ today is acting very strange. And this is org example entities product. So you literally have to define here the name of 9+, and I'm using 17, so 9. I thought 17 is larger than 9. At least last time I checked in my mathematics book, 17 was larger than 9. Oh, here it is. This is the problem, I guess. Okay, fine. So normally here you would basically use reflection or something to get the class names, because you don't like literally want every time someone creates a new entity to have to put it in this list. But I will skip that. But the idea is that when we will see the Spring part, you will understand that what happens behind the scenes. So behind the scenes, this is exactly what happens. Do I need something else? You have that feeling that I'm missing something, but I don't think I'm missing anything. It's just in my head. So then I can just go here, my main, and just prove maybe that we can grab something from the database or write a query or something like that. So I will create a new persistence unit info descriptor based on my persistent unit, which is basically the object I created here. And let's take this into a variable. So I'm usually I'm using Lombok. Today I just didn't add it to this example, but yes, usually I'm using Lombok. However, I'm not using the data annotation because that one is also overriding the hash code and equals, if I correctly remember, and toString, and that's a little bit I don't recommend that, especially if you have bidirectional relationships. It can be a burden. So I'm using Lombok, but usually I'm using just the getter and setter annotation. Why I'm not using Lombok here in this example? Just because I forgot to add the dependencies, so it's nothing special. And now we have the Entity Manager Factory. Entity Manager Factory. And you can do something like this to get, and then something like this. So this Entity Manager Factory, this is actually defined by the JPA specification. If I'm going somewhere back, I had here not this one, this was the one, entity manager factory and the entity manager, see, they are described by the specification. The entity manager factory in JPA is the factory that creates the entity manager objects based on the properties that you have given. The entity manager is the object managing the context. So everything that I'm using here, I try to go back now, is part of the Jakarta. Now, because I've been using Hibernate and I try to do this working with directly the persistent unit, I had to use some specific Hibernate tools to create the entity manager factory, but that happens only once, so only when I create the factory. Then everything that follows, like the entity manager and the operations, are part of the Jakarta persistence API specification. Like for example, I can create an entity manager and then I can create a query, which should be a JPQL. And I'm just writing something, so it doesn't have necessarily a meaning. I'm just creating a query for the demonstration purposes. And this should give me a typed query. Product. And then of course I need to set the parameter. And then I can get result list. And print them in the console, whatever. So this is how you work with Hibernate, which is a JPA, a Jakarta E specification. JPA is the implementation, this is the Jakarta specification. I thought that my POM XML already specified Java 17. Okay, again, IntelliJ is acting strange today for some reason. Okay, fine, looks like it's working. And you can see that Hibernate boots, and of course I didn't define a toString, but if I do, you will see better the ID and the name of the product that has been selected. So that's Hibernate. Hibernate is a framework. It's an implementation of the Jakarta Persistence API, also known as JPA specification, and is an ORM framework that, if you know how to use right, will minimize a lot the work, the lines of code that you write, because what you see here, what I did, this happens only once. So only once you define a persistence unit, and then you just need, only once you define a factory, and then you just need to write this to get, for example, a list. So you just grab a manager and then you can run a query and usually set the parameters. You can immediately grab the list. If you want more details on what you can do and how this works and don't know them, you can start with my JPA fundamentals playlist on the same channel. But the idea is, and that's where you will trust me, of course, it's much simpler than using directly JDBC. So the whole idea is that I'm going back to my diagram, and I'm going to erase everything here. So you have the option of using directly JDBC, but then it takes many. Or you have the possibility to use JPA, a JPA implementation such as Hibernate, which will still go through JDBC, so in the end behind the scenes is the same thing. But this is the other way around. So maybe I'm just writing here JPA implementation will be always easier, so it takes less lines of code than if you use JDBC. Of course, again, I don't say it's perfect because ORM frameworks, and we know that already, have high complexity and you can make a lot of mistakes, but it still saves a lot of code. So considering you know it well, then I would go with a framework, and preferably a framework that implements the JPA specification rather than using JDBC directly. Now, where does Spring come to the scene? Because you see, this is no Spring at all here, no other framework. So this is just a clean Java 17 application which uses Hibernate to connect to a database. And see that for the operation I only use types which are defined by the Jakarta Persistence API specification. That means that if I change Hibernate with something else, I don't have to change the operation implementation. What I would change is a few lines of code. So here I would change something, and then I would also have to change here the persistence provider class name, but that's only one time in your application. While these kinds of operations, they will be in your repositories in a normal application, and they will be in many, repeated in many times. So that means that it's like literally, if you use the JPA specification and you want to, for some reason, 10 years from now on, or maybe less, there will be a framework that's much better. Even if you have used Hibernate, you can very comfortably change Hibernate with that new framework in the future, because you have used the contract, and JPA is the contract. So you see, that's the big deal. That's why we need a specification. That's why JPA is so important, because I'm using Hibernate now, but if tomorrow I want to change Hibernate with some other framework that's better, then I can do that without having to change my whole application, as long as that other framework fulfills the specification. And okay, I will say it again, there are things which are custom to Hibernate. If you use those, then of course those will not work anymore if you want to change Hibernate, but that's why it's better to stick to the contract as much as possible and don't use things that are outside of the contract. And now there is one more thing that usually creates confusion between JPA and Hibernate, and that is people seeing old examples on the web where Hibernate is used with Session Factory class. Have you seen something like that? Session Factory builder, do they tell you something? Does the session in general, Session Factory and session classes interfaces, tell you something? If yes, it means that you either learned from an old material or you are working with an old application. This Session Factory, it's been in Hibernate before the JPA specification was introduced. Because now, going back to what we were discussing at the beginning of this video, I told you why JPA appeared. And remember, I was telling you have framework 1, framework 2, framework 3, and they are totally independent, so it means that you can't like literally change one with another, okay? And that was the reason for needing a specification like JPA. And Hibernate was one of that frameworks. So Hibernate existed before JPA. Hibernate is an old framework. It's one of the first frameworks that tried to make connection to a database easier. And it existed before the JPA specification. And what Hibernate tried to do is, when the JPA specification appeared, it modulated to the requirements of the JPA specification. So the session factory interface, you couldn't change it completely, isn't it? Because the framework was already there. So it's pretty nasty to completely change the session factory, which was at that time and still is one of the backbone objects, one of the backbone elements in the design, in the framework design. You can't change that now to just make it entity manager factory, because that's what at that time Hibernate need to do, is to going back to the specification. It needed to stick to the interfaces in the specification. It needed to make Hibernate work with Entity Manager Factory, with Entity Manager, and with everything else, the way the operations looked like and everything else that's described by JPA, by that specification. Otherwise, Hibernate was not a JPA, or wouldn't have become a JPA implementation. But that's basically something that a decision that has been very wisely taken at that time to make Hibernate a JPA implementation. How did they make it? Well, to be very easy, they changed the session factory contract to extend the entity manager contract, and then they changed everything that needed to be changed so that you can still work with Hibernate the old way, but you can also work with Hibernate as a JPA implementation. So that starting from that time on, people could use Hibernate as a JPA implementation and make it through the contract of the JPA, through what JPA defines, independent. So if you know about session factory and session, they are still here in Hibernate, just that now they are abstracted by the contract. So you don't use directly session factory, but behind the scenes, when I did this, I'm still using session factory and session. But I'm using them decoupled, because if I used session factory, then I would have used something from Hibernate. You see, it's clearly seen in the import that session factory is something that is not of the contract, but part of the implementation itself. And then I would have my application stuck on Hibernate. If I don't use session factory and instead I use the upper contracts, which are part of the Jakarta specification, formerly known as Java EE, then I have the opportunity to replace easily in my application the Hibernate implementation with any other implementation I need. That's it. That's JPA versus Hibernate. And I hope things are much more clear now in terms of what Hibernate is, what JPA is, and why do we have JPA, how did it appear, how Hibernate appeared. Questions? So when working with multiple filtering criteria, are JPA, where to go? I'm going now to Spring Data JPA, so I'm just going into Spring Data JPA, and then Entity Manager Factory hash map are for properties. Yes, indeed. So the map that I was using here, it's empty here, but you could fill it with properties. That's true. And I think in configuration with old one, yes, XML file. The XML file can replace what I did here. So this basically this approach where I use a class, you will see it in applications also with that so-called persistence XML file. Usually we don't use now the persistence XML to configure our JPA implementation anymore, because we need, and it's much more easier to make it in a programmatic way. So that's why I chose this to make it without XML now. Okay, now I'm going to the last topic of today, which is Hibernate versus Spring Data JPA. And allow me go to my diagram again. And let's say this is the database. And above the database, you know already that you have the driver. And above the driver and the JDK interfaces, you have the JPA implementation. And above this, some frameworks like Spring Data JPA or Quarkus Panache try to simplify even more what Hibernate is. So what is Spring Data JPA actually? It is a way to make even more abstract the work with the behind the scenes JPA implementation. By default, if you use Spring Boot, you will still have Hibernate as a default, but instead Spring itself will make the use of Hibernate much easier. Is your JPA playlist still compatible? Yes, it is. So everything you find in the JPA playlist on this channel is still 100% useful. So do use it with trust. It's working fine. Let me create a Spring Data JPA project to show you that. So Spring Initializer, and that will be JPA Hibernate E2, and then I will, let's say, just create a web application that uses MySQL driver. See, I can't skip adding the MySQL driver. I still need the MySQL driver. And then one thing to be aware of is that Spring Data is not necessarily only Spring Data JPA. Spring Data is a Spring abstraction that works over several technologies. So you can have Spring Data that's abstracting directly JDBC, and it doesn't use behind the scenes Hibernate. If you use Spring Data JPA, by default with Spring Boot you will use Hibernate behind the scenes, but you can replace Hibernate with some other JPA implementation. It's not dependent on Hibernate. Spring Data can be used in a reactive application using Mono and Flux. Spring Data can be used with almost any other NoSQL technology. So Spring Data is not Spring Data JPA. When you say Spring Data, you refer to that Spring module, Spring project, I think it's more correct to say, Spring project that implements different modules to make more abstract the work with a specific data persistence technology. Spring Data can be used having behind the scenes Hibernate or a JPA implementation, as we will show now, but at the same time it can be used directly over JDBC. So you see, that's in my diagram, and I specifically mentioned here Spring Data JPA, this JPA here, and some people will still say that it's not clear. Spring Data JPA, because at the same time I could have had the following diagram: database, driver, and then Spring Data JDBC. Okay, and then you can see the difference between this one here and this one is that in this case Spring Data JPA uses Hibernate or another JPA implementation behind the scenes, while Spring Data JDBC is directly over JDBC. Okay. So you have to be very attentive when you say Spring Data. Don't make a confusion considering Spring Data it's only Spring Data JPA, because a lot of developers make this confusion when they start learning about Spring Data, just because a lot of examples out there they are with Spring Data JPA, which kind of makes sense, but sometimes it fools beginners, making them believe that Spring Data is something that's always over Hibernate or always over a JPA implementation, which is not the case. Spring Data is not only one project. Spring Data is defining a large variety of dependencies, and depending on which one you choose, you will or you will not work with a relational database. You might work with a NoSQL one. You will or you will not work using a JPA implementation. You might want to implement a reactive approach again. So extending CRUD repository instead of JPA repositories basically means using Spring Data JDBC? No, it doesn't mean that, because if I'm now adding JPA, if I'm adding this dependency and I'm using CRUD repository, I will still use JPA. But if I will add this dependency, I can only use CRUD repository, and then I will use JDBC. The difference between if you use or not Hibernate is what dependency you add in your POM XML rather than the contract you implement. So if you have added Spring Data JPA in your POM XML, it doesn't matter which contract of the series of the repository contracts Spring Data offers, you will still use JPA. You can't escape that. You can't have an application where you use both JDBC and JPA through Spring Data. That's something impossible. If you want to use Spring Data JDBC, then you add this dependency instead, and then you will use directly JDBC. If you add this dependency, the JPA one, then you will automatically go through JPA. And now we can actually, because I remembered, you can use Lombok as well. Now let's create. We are a bit over the time that I scheduled for this meeting, but I want to completely answer the question, and that's demonstrating how is different, how is the usage of Spring Data JPA different than our previous approach, where we directly used Hibernate with Java without Spring at all. And of course Spring Boot is full of magic, so you just have to go here to define the data source. I can define the Hikari bin, that's still possible, but I don't need to do that, so I can just say Spring Data source URL, username and password. I don't have a password, so I can leave it like this. And then I just define the entities, and I'm just going to do that. I will prove that it's the same. So I'm just going to like literally copy the entities package from here. Okay, so it is the same, just that for some reason still related to IntelliJ. Definitely my annotations are not seen. So let me again try to re-import, hoping that IntelliJ will work in the end, but trust me, it's the same. Is there any case where you prefer using vanilla JDBC over Spring JDBC? No, that's definitely no case I would say where I would use that. Yeah, I see again. So IntelliJ it's again not working, which is not kind of bothering me. But I started to get used with that. So let me try again a restart. Well, it's kind of if you use vanilla JDBC, you will literally have to write 20 lines of code instead of writing 2, and it doesn't bring you any benefits. So I wouldn't say there is any case in which I would use, if I have the possibility to use Spring Data JDBC, I use Spring Data JDBC. I wouldn't go to vanilla. Okay. How can we create a different database connection? You can simply create a bin of the type data source. Raja, you can see that in the Spring Fundamentals playlist, I guess. Okay, so we hope that the gods of IntelliJ will now help us, and then we can just create an endpoint and prove how much more transparent using Spring Data JPA is. Okay, while still working, so how can we create a different database connection and get the respective data source for it? You can again create a different bin of type data source in the configuration file, and then you can inject it appropriately. You can have multiple bins of type data source and use the qualifier annotation to inject it. You will find an example of this in the Spring Fundamentals playlist. Okay. Maybe meanwhile I can actually even go further and define the repository. And for example, in this case, because you were asking me, can I extend here? Usually I would extend JPA repository, right? So usually I would do that and say product and integer, where product is the entity and integer is the type of the primary key. But if I'm going here to use CRUD repository, which is possible, that doesn't mean that I'm not using JPA, because behind the scenes I added Spring Data JPA. So still, if I'm extending CRUD repository here, I'm still using JPA. It's just a difference of what methods I can use, because CRUD repository is a little bit above JPA repository in the inheritance tree. So I will not be able to use some methods which make my life easier with JPA, but I'm still not avoiding JPA. Once in my POM XML I have added Spring Data JPA, now I'm using JPA and I can't avoid that. If I want to use Spring Data JDBC, then I have to add the proper configuration. So that's why it doesn't really make a difference here if you use CRUD or JPA in this case. So I'm going with JPA repository and import the product class as well. Okay, and then when I now want to write that query, now it's much easier, because instead find products by name. So instead of writing, and let's see how many lines of code did we write in our previous application to achieve this. Is I'm not looking into configuration, just on the lines of code starting from the entity manager. So I wrote from line 21 to line 30. Just to, let's not take this one, because this is just the display. From 21 to 26, so I wrote 6 lines of code. Okay, maybe if I'm very, I still wrote 4 lines of code. This is the minimum I can say. But now what I can do is I replace all these 4 lines of code the way you see them, and in my second project they will be replaced by literally 2 lines of code. I'm usually with Java 17, I'm usually using text blocks, because it's when you have more lines of the query, it's easier. So you see, very easy, clearly very easy. And then you can do whatever you want. If you want to prove it's working, just go here, controllers. Wow, so I literally cannot write above my class. Wow. So it's today IntelliJ is full of bugs. So you see this white line between 5 and 6. Jesus. Let's hope we will at least be able to finish our example. So today in 1 hour of live, I think I found more bugs in IntelliJ than I found in like the past 5 applications I've implemented. Now I usually use a service class, okay, so I'm usually not using the repository directly, but in this case, like, to make it easier, I will just do that. Okay, fine. So it's not finding my repository now. Okay, thank you IntelliJ. It should be something like this. And this should be the method. And most likely, if I'm building it again or restarting IntelliJ again, if it will work, but that's the case. Yeah, I probably have to restart it again. Invalidate caches, restart, and it will work. Okay, and now to conclude, because you probably trust me, it's working, and you saw the difference. So what was actually the difference between this? So the amount of lines of code you wrote. I didn't prove you at the beginning how it looks with JDBC, but trust me, it's more than 4 lines, so it's maybe 20, can be. And then we reduced this using a framework. We reduced it to about, you've seen, about 4 lines, okay? So we reduced that try catch of SQL exception and a lot of lines of code when we were using directly directly vanilla JDBC. We reduced it to 4 lines of code in this case. And then from the 4 lines of code, we managed to reduce it even further, like to only a couple of lines of code. And I also need the parameter here, so it's string. Well, I can't say I love IntelliJ, but I also can't say that I found a better IDE. Although someone recommended me to use a Visual Studio, I didn't have the chance to try it. But maybe I will try that in the future, because IntelliJ seems to be more and more buggy throughout the time, so it's started to be impossible to use it anymore. Okay, so guys, I've shown you the code. I don't think it now makes sense. You can trust me, this is working. I will put it also on GitHub, so you can try it yourself. But the idea is, and I think with this I've managed to make a good comparison between, and tell you what JPA is. I told you why we ended up having a specification. So if you watch the video from the beginning, you will see me describing the reasons a specification was needed. You know what Hibernate is now. It's an implementation. You know that Hibernate was there before JPA. Okay, so first there was Hibernate, and then Hibernate made it implemented JPA. Okay, the reason we have frameworks is to minimize the lines of code, and the more abstract you go, the fewer lines of code you write. So when we were writing code with vanilla JDBC, we were writing many lines of code, 10, 15, 20, for like a normal query, a normal select, and then reduce that to only 3-4 lines with Hibernate, and then reduce that to only a couple of lines with Spring Data, which is abstracting even more the Hibernate solution. So that's basically, and hopefully with this I've managed to answer and clarify this difference. The GitHub link will always be in every video, in the comment section and in the description of the video. I put it in both places. After the live event, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to push all the code on GitHub, and then I will share the link with you in the comment section and in the description of the video. And that's how you find, for absolutely every video on this channel that has code, you find also the code shared at that time. Okay, still not working, but oh, now it is. Okay, I managed to import it. And let's just say beer here. We could have assumed this coming from path variable or something like that. And then I need to do something like this. Say path variable string name. And I can now start it and prove it's working the same, just that for the connection to a database I literally only had to write a method in an interface and the query above it. So that's it. So guys, I think with this being said, I can say that I clarified this aspect. If there are still questions in the JPA versus Hibernate versus Spring Data, please let me know in the comment section. You can always find me also on Twitter and LinkedIn. You can always put your questions in the comment section if you still have. But mainly this is the whole idea, and with again proved with code that this is how it works. And again, until next time we meet, I'd say have an excellent time for study further, I thank you again for being here with me, and I hope to see you for other videos where we'll discuss some other excellent topics that you suggest, of course. So please do suggest me topics in the comment section, and I will try to make videos where I just prove and try to explain them as good as possible. Until next time we meet, guys, I'm waving goodbye and I'm saying have an excellent time for learning further. Cheers, everyone.